My game has changed a lot over the past year, and one aspect that I'm continuing to make updates to is the combat system. In the original version of this game, the player could only attack in the 4 cardinal directions, and I felt like this really limited the gameplay. So the game was overhauled with not only some new graphics, but a setup where you can attack in any direction. This allowed a lot more flexibility with the player's movement, making a much snappier experience. What I'm concerned about is how the items are equipped and used during gameplay. Currently, you can only equip 2 items at once, and it means that those are really your only options to use during combat, since opening a menu mid-battle is not ideal. There's going to be lots of different items and abilities you can use, and I don't want players to be limited to only 2 of them. The first step I took is making it so you can have 3 items equipped at once, a main item for the left click, a side item for the right click, and now spells have their own slot tied to the F key. By the way, I'm speaking in terms of mouse and keyboard, but I'll be adding controller support as well, so I need to keep this in mind, making sure that what I create makes sense for both layouts. I have 3 spells currently implemented: Lightning, where every nearby enemy takes damage, Fire, which pushes back, hits twice, and applies a burn, and Ice, which inflicts a debuff that lowers their defense. Spells are meant to be large, heavy-hitting attacks that don't require any directional input, since in the keyboard layout, spells are not tied to the mouse. And they operate on a short cooldown, so players have an incentive to use a spell as soon as it's ready. I'll explain in a moment why I decided on a cooldown system, but I'd like to focus again on giving the players more access to their items during combat. Having spells as an extra equipable ability is a nice improvement, but I still want more flexibility. After brainstorming options, I decided on implementing a loadout system. I defined a loadout as any combination of a main item, side item, and spell, and you can swap between these loadouts on the fly during gameplay. As I'm communicating this feature to players though, I think I want to less focus on the term loadout and focus more on how the spells and side items are directly tied to the main item that the player has equipped. So rather than swapping between loadouts, you're swapping between your main weapons, which in turn changes which spells and side items you have available. And what's nice about this is that it naturally builds in complexity over the course of the game. The player will start with just the sword, they might learn a couple spells or find side items, only using one of each at a time. But once they're into the game where they find the second main weapon, the bow, then suddenly the combat grows in complexity, because now there's access to 2 loadouts. The player went from having only 3 options during combat to now having 6. But gaining access to all 6 will require swapping between the 2 available loadouts, needing a bit of additional skill from the player. For this to be meaningful though, there needs to be a strong incentive to actually do this loadout swap during combat. And this brings me back to these spell cooldowns. Since each spell independently has its own cooldown timer, the best way to maximize damage output is to keep track of those cooldowns and use each ability once they're ready. The spells are meant to be really powerful burst attacks, and there's no cost to using them, meaning that every battle can start with me rushing in, casting one spell, immediately switching over to a different weapon to cast that spell, so then at that point both spells are recovering at the same time. From then on, you can swap between your weapons to keep track of the cooldowns, and whenever something's ready, you can cast it again. The best part about all of this is that it's totally optional to play optimally like this. If a player wanted to keep things simple and just stick to one loadout at a time, they'd still be able to deal plenty of damage and get through the game just fine. The whole system is there for players that want to get through the game faster, land some flashy combos, and it'll likely be required for some of the extra hard side quest content I have planned. I can't take credit for coming up with all of these ideas on my own. I was inspired recently when playing through God of War Ragnarok. I think this game's combat system is near perfect, and it works in part to its weapon swapping mechanic. You have light and heavy runic attacks on each weapon, which are just really strong abilities. And I found it so satisfying running into battle, using up both of these abilities to deal massive damage right off the bat, then switch over to the other weapon, use those runic attacks as well, and then continue the fight from there. Minor gameplay spoiler for this game, so skip ahead if you don't want to hear about a new item that Kratos gets mid-game. There's a third weapon you get, the spear. Not only is the weapon itself very unique and fun to use, but since there's now a third weapon available, that also means I have access to 2 more runic attacks I can use throughout the battle. Having the spear available not only gives me more ways I can take down opponents, but it's treated like a loadout with its own set of strong abilities. And its addition to the game naturally increases the complexity of the gameplay. So you can probably see the similarities to my game. You have multiple main weapons, each with their own abilities, and you can swap between the weapons on the fly. In general, I simplified and adapted the God of War system into something similar that fits more into my game's playstyle. I'm really hopeful that players will like this new format, but as always, I'm reading and responding to feedback in the comments and on my Discord. I do think that in the final product, where the player starts with only one weapon, then easing them into the spells and the side items, and then from there easing them into multiple weapons, I'm pretty optimistic. Things might get too complex when a third main weapon is introduced, but I'll let my future self deal with that. If you're interested in trying out the current demo, the link is in the description. Let me know your thoughts, and I'm also curious if you agree that cooldowns are the way to go for the abilities. Something like mana could be an option too, but I'm not quite sure. Thanks so much for watching.